Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending where you are. We're just waiting for the participants to be joining into this webinar. And as soon as we see that number stabilizing, it'll be in just a couple of minutes, and we will then proceed with the webinar. For those of you expecting to see Arsen Ostrovsky here, Arsen is currently making a presentation to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He is there at the moment. My name is Nadav Steinman. I'm the chair of the board of ILF. So welcome to everybody who is here. We're going to dismiss with regular formalities that take place in these types of sessions, because I wanted to introduce our guests first, because the topics we have are quite many. They're topics of international law as they apply to the current war situation in Israel. So I'm going to ask Natasha and Mark to introduce themselves and what they will be speaking about, and we'll get right into it. Throughout this webinar, there's an opportunity to, in the question and answer box, to ask your questions. We will get to as many of those as possible. Please don't hesitate to ask them. If there is anything else, you can raise your hand and we will try to assist you in the background. My colleague Asher Stern is as well as from ILF is here as well. He's handling the technical stuff, your questions and answers and everything else, but I'll put it right now to Natasha and Mark to start everything, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Nadav. I'm Natasha Hausdorff. I'm a barrister practicing in the United Kingdom, and I also have the great privilege to serve as the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, in which so much of our work is focused on Israel and international law specifically. And I come with a bit of a background, academic background in the law of armed conflict that I know Mark will be starting off the discussion with.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Goldfeder. I'm director of the National Jewish Advocacy Center in the United States. I'm also a former law professor. I've taught international law in the United States, Europe, and in Israel. And I'll be covering a sort of a short primer on the international humanitarian law aspects that affect the current conflict.
Okay, thank you. So, Natasha, why don't you start, and we'll move the discussion going forward, but give us the idea of more of the topics you're going to be discussing and explaining to all of us here, and I appreciate your attendance. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I think the plan was for Mark to give the initial overview of IHL.
Excuse me.
So I don't want to steal his thunder.
No, Mark,
please go ahead.
Yeah, it makes more sense probably to do that before Natasha talks about how that might play out on the world stage. So
thank you.
If you've been following along, I know that a lot of us thought that given the horrific images that came out of the Simchat Torah attack, we'd have a little bit more of a sustained international law response in favor of Israel, but that hasn't really happened. Within 3 days, the politicians, pundits, and members of the pseudo-intellectual public started to regain their composure, even after seeing pictures of dead babies, to justify the massacre by proclaiming it seemed like the victims had it coming. And once again, they're predictably accusing Israel of war crimes for daring to respond to the slaughter of its citizens. And there's a lot of legal misinformation that's being spread by people who either don't understand IHL, international humanitarian law, or are purposely misusing international law when it comes to discussing the current conflict in the Middle East. But those rules are there. They're designed to try and create a framework that can help us make some sense of the chaos of war. And so it's really important that any and all discussions remain firmly grounded in the facts. You can't talk about what Israel should do if you don't talk first what Israel has to do and doesn't have to do. Now, the central feature, this is really important, of the law of armed conflict is to prevent unnecessary casualties and to protect innocent civilians. That's the core. And international humanitarian law does this primarily through the application of 3 fundamental governing principles that work in tandem with one another. There's the principles of distinction, military necessity, and proportionality. Now, the most basic rule, it's actually literally the first rule in the manual of customary international humanitarian law, is the principle of distinction, which requires that the parties to the conflict must at all times distinguish between civilians and combatants. Attacks may only be directed against combatants. Attacks must not be directed against civilians. Obviously, Hamas completely and unabashedly disregards every aspect of that convention. and they kill helpless, innocent non-combatants on purpose. Nevertheless, that doesn't absolve the IDF of their commitment, and the IDF does remain firmly committed to the rule of law and does not and will not target civilians. And experts who have been monitoring the situation, particularly the Lieber Institute for Law and Warfare at West Point, have noted and continue to note that there are no reliable reports that the Israel Defense Forces have intentionally targeted civilians. Now, again, this to be clear, that does not mean that Israel is not responding currently to Hamas, and nor does it mean that there will not be additional tragic loss of innocent life as a result of Israel's response. The principle of military necessity, which is the second important principle, actually permits measures which are necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose and are not otherwise prohibited by international humanitarian law. So, for example, blockades or sieges, like the one in Gaza, are not prohibited in international law. The Geneva Conventions explain how to do it properly, right? A siege law has humanitarian aspects, including the facilitation of food and medicine by third parties, but only if they can be reliably delivered without diversion to the enemy. And if you saw from the UN's post yesterday, which they since deleted, and I'm sure someone got killed for posting it, Hamas actually stole some of the supplies that are going in, which relieves Israel of the requirement to keep on passing things through. They don't have to feed Hamas while they're fighting them. Okay, so that brings us really to the next part of the equation, because those two principles are in tension with each other, right? The International Red Cross has pointed out that almost by definition, military necessity runs counter to humanitarian exigencies, right? So the purpose of humanitarian law is to strike a balance between military necessity on the one hand and humanitarian exigencies on the other hand. And that balance is generally struck by operation of the third fundamental principle, which is the principle of proportionality. And if you haven't heard this misused yet, you're definitely going to hear it misused in the next couple of weeks. So let's start out by just giving a quick definition. The principle of proportionality forbids attacks in which the expected incidental loss of civilian life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects, any combination, would be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage gained. There's a lot of information there, okay? Let's be clear. The calculus involved in proportionality is not about revenge. There was an interview going around a couple of days ago. I forget who it was. It was a UK commentator who said, you know, if you think proportionality is about revenge and Israel's response is not proportionate, how many people should we go in and rape and kill? And that would be a proportionate response. Obviously, that's not what it means, okay? So it's not about striking back against your enemy in direct proportion to how hard you were hit. That's not what proportionality means. And it's also not, and this is crucial, it's not a capabilities comparison that tries to balance your weaponry or technology against theirs, which is why some of the insane radical left in the US don't want Israel to have an Iron Dome. It's not fair that they have better technology. It's also not an effects-based comparison, right? A relative comparison looks at the amount of damage or the number of dead bodies on both sides, right? That kind of perverse reasoning is why Hamas continues to engage in the use of human shields and murders their own men, women, and children to artificially widen the asymmetry, not the legal proportionality gap. Again, let's just delve in on that for a second. Proportionality has nothing to do, this is super important, it's the most common mistake in these contexts, nothing to do with the relative number of people killed on both sides. Nothing. And again, the reason is clear. If you judge the appropriateness of an attack based on the number of people who died, you don't protect civilians, you incentivize human shields. So Israel, for example, anticipates that its response to these unprecedented attacks will have the important advantage of ending Hamas's genocidal reign of terror. So international law recognizes that there's a possibility of civilian casualties. It's an unfortunate, but it's an expected, the word's in there, element of even lawful missions. Israel is required to try and minimize that number, and the IDF is doing that, right? Including the use of targeted precision strikes, warning civilians to leave certain neighborhoods or even to head out of Gaza entirely across the border that it shares with Egypt, and it doesn't target civilians. Now, Hamas knows that people in the government and in the media either misunderstand or willfully distort what proportionality means and pretend it has something to do with the relative number of dead bodies on each side. And they consistently take advantage of this dangerous misconception by putting their own civilian population into harm's way. And then they're doing this now. The rocket that they launched that fell at a hospital was launched from a cemetery, right? It was from a cemetery behind a hospital. They do this with sickening disregard for the lives of their own people in order to inflate the body count and to make things look even more disproportionate to an undiscerning media. So beware this behavior and this trap, because under an effects-based, non-legal analysis that people tend to use, that inhumane calculus is actually often rewarded with sympathetic PR pieces. Okay, so from an international law perspective, what is an internationally proportionate response? To be clear, Israel has not only the right to a shock and awe response, but under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it actually has an affirmative obligation on behalf of the world to make sure that never again really means never again. Proportionality is a prospective, forward-looking analysis that permits the risk of collateral damage necessary to achieve a just military objective. Okay, the greater the military objective you need to achieve, the greater the extent of permitted risk of incidental damage or even, God forbid, death. So as it relates to Israel's current operation, right, the legitimate military purpose is to wipe out Hamas. It's an openly genocidal terrorist organization that indiscriminately kills both Israeli and Palestinian men, women, and children. Now, obviously, there are international law principles of self-defense. But aside from that, again, under the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, there's actually an affirmative obligation to prevent and punish genocide. So really, the world should be saying thank you. But even if they don't say thank you, saving millions of lives from terrorists who would demonstrably, brutally end those lives if given the slightest chance is an overwhelmingly necessary and just military objective. Again, Israel still has to do everything it can to minimize civilian casualties, which is why the IDF is taking those important measures. It's made more difficult, again, with Hamas continuing to hide munition stores in hospitals and schools. By the way, another important rule, which is actually a corollary to the principle of distinction, is the principle for combatants to distinguish themselves from the civilian population, right? It's supposed to wear distinctive insignia, drive special cars, identified military vehicles, etc. Obviously, Hamas does not do that. So just to wrap that part up, right? It doesn't mean that innocent people won't suffer. In all very terrible likelihood, they will. But it does mean that any unavoidable loss of life or collateral damage is entirely on Hamas's account. Okay? No innocent Palestinian men, women, or children should ever be hurt or killed. And I want to reiterate that each life lost on either side, innocent life, is an inexcusable tragedy. But each of those tragedies was caused by the murderous decisions and actions of Hamas and not by a legitimate, necessary, proportionate response to those actions. Very important to stay morally clear on both those things, because both of those things can be true. What's interesting, though, is that Israel's current overwhelmingly necessary military purpose is so clear that even the secondary complaints that we generally see, so right now we're seeing in the international law community contentions that Israel's engaging in collective punishment, right, or forced transfer, even those are gaining less traction than they usually do because of the overwhelmingly proportionate response that Israel is engaged in. Again, for reference, a proportional response is by definition not collective punishment. You're not targeting a civilian population, you're targeting Hamas, and there's a risk of incidental damage to a civilian population. And there's also a massive difference between warning citizens to temporarily evacuate a danger zone for their own safety, which is actually a requirement under the Geneva Conventions, as opposed to a forcible transfer, which is illegally driving them out as part of an attack against a civilian population, right? Saving civilian lives is not a war crime. And under any other situation, people would be thanking Israel for fulfilling their obligation, and people would be putting pressure on Hamas to surrender, and the conflict would end immediately, as would civilian casualties on both sides. I see I'm over my 15 minutes, so I'll pause here and turn it to the...
On your pause, couple of just quick notes. First, everybody know that I'd like everyone to know that we are recording this session, and we will have it available on our webpage. For those who didn't hear the opening, Arsen Ostrovsky is currently making a presentation in person in Strasbourg, France at the EU Parliament, and he's unable to be here. My name is Nadav Steinman. I'm chair of the board of ILF. Just, not as a summary, but just because someone asked it, and I think it would be great for all of us, and a lot of us, myself including, are taking notes. But would you be able to give like a 3-sentence definition, a legal definition, or a proportionality, so that we understand the strict legal meaning of that? That would be very helpful.
Yes, proportionality is discussed in a number of different places. I think the easiest definition and the clearest definition is probably Article 8(2)(b)(4) of the Rome Statute. I'm going to pull it up because I don't want to misquote at all something that I complain about in others. So hold on one second. I will quote it, and then I will walk through exactly what it means, so that everybody is clear and on the same page. Okay. The principle of proportionality forbids attacks in which the expected civilian casualties from the attack will be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage gained. Now, let's walk through that for a second. The principle of proportionality forbids attacks in which the expected civilian casualties from the attack will be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage gained. So what do we see from that definition? Number one, not all deaths in wartime are unlawful, right? Even civilian casualties are inevitable and sometimes expected under international humanitarian law. And there's two key analytical factors in that proportionality framework. The first is the term excessive, okay? Excessive civilian casualties, in light of the second term, anticipated military gain, are unlawful. So not attacks that are likely to cause any civilian casualties, not attacks that are likely to cause a lot of civilian casualties, or even attacks that are likely to cause civilian casualties that are slightly greater than the military gain. The only thing that's unlawful are military attacks that cause civilian casualties that are excessive as compared to the military gain. Now, again, take a look at the definition. Proportionality, as we mentioned before, it's a prospective analysis. It's forward-looking, meaning that it applies to commanders in the field who have to assess in real time, in battle conditions, whether the risk of civilian harm is excessive based on the information that they now have about the target, right? About civilians in the area, about patterns of movement, about weather, about weapons being deployed back against them, etc. This is really important. They don't need to be right. They need to be reasonable in the moment. This is not an armchair quarterback on CNN 10 days later with all of the facts calmly laid out before them. If it was reasonable for the person to assume what they assumed in the moment, that it wasn't excessive in light of the military advantage expected or anticipated to be gained, then that is a lawful attack. Hindsight has absolutely no role here. And again, there's obviously an urge to simply count up the casualties and declare a war crime afterwards. It's a very powerful urge, but as we said, it's very, very dangerous and it's legally invalid.
Thank you. Before we move on to Natasha, I just want to put something in your mind so that you can reply to it a little bit later. A very good question was asked is, how does Hamas's holding of hostages affect the proportionality analysis? So I'm going to just hold that question and ask you to reply to that later and move it over to Natasha. Thanks, Natasha.
Thank you, Nadav, and thank you, Mark. May I thank Mark for his brilliant overview of IHL, setting the record straight. And I'm also glad to have seen his Twitter battles with AOC and others, or should I say education sessions. They've garnered significant attention, pushing back on this blatant misrepresentation of international law and essentially propagation of Hamas propaganda. I echo everything that Mark has said about the proper application of international law and Israeli military practice. And it is so important now, where the misrepresentations of the law of armed conflict are unprecedented. I read just a few hours ago that John F. Kirby, a retired United States Navy Rear Admiral, said that the proper number of civilian casualties in a conflict like this is 0. So I just want to pick up on that ludicrous and deeply irresponsible statement, if the reports are correct, and provide some context from the Jerusalem Post to perhaps give some colour to the principles that Mark has just been setting out. Because according to data from the United Nations, the global civilian to combatant ratio of casualties is 9-1. And that means that on average, wars produce a disturbing 9 civilian casualties for every combatant. And according to data from the United Nations, from the United States National Institute of Health, the ratio produced by the United States in the 2003 Iraq War was 3-1. And in Afghanistan, there are various sources that put the numbers anywhere from 3-1 to 5-1. If we step back and compare that with the last Israeli operation, Operation Shield and Arrow in Jenin, which I appreciate is a very different context to what we are currently looking at, but it is still pertinent, Israel achieved a ratio of 0.6-1. So more terrorists than civilians killed. That is a significantly lower ratio of civilian casualties compared to any other conflict in the world that I have looked at. And that is extremely significant in the context of increasing international criticism, specifically focusing on the issue of proportionality, because the understanding of Israel's position immediately after the 7th of October has not lasted particularly long. So I was proposing to focus on international aspects in 2 respects. First, the causes of what we have witnessed. And if I may echo again some of what Mark has mentioned, the responsibility of the international community as well as Israel. And second, perhaps sort of broader obligations and international law arising from the atrocities committed against Israeli civilians. And aspects of this, of course, inform Israel's response as well. And Mark has mentioned from an international law perspective that Israel does not only have the right to a robust response, but under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it also has an affirmative obligation. That obligation is not just Israel's. It applies to all states party to this convention, an international treaty that criminalizes genocide and obligates state parties to pursue the enforcement of its prohibition. It was the first legal instrument to codify genocide as a crime in 1948. Added to that, I would also seek to raise United Nations Security Council Resolution 1373, which was adopted unanimously on the 28th of September 2001 as a counterterrorism measure. It was adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, and it required states, it said decides, that all states shall prevent and suppress the financing of terrorist acts, criminalize the willful provision or collection by any means, directly or indirectly, of funds by their nationals or in their territories with the intention that the funds should be used, or in the knowledge that they are to be used to carry out terrorist acts. So all states are charged with preventing even indirect support for terror organizations. And that's extremely important to bear in mind in light of what we have witnessed over the last just over 10 days. And that links, I hope, neatly into aspects of the international responsibility for the latest developments and the causes of what we have witnessed. Seeing an invasion of over 3,000 terrorists from Gaza. And I should stress that these are groups that are much wider than Hamas. They include Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP members, and Fatah. How is it that this was possible? Well, we have seen reports that between January and August this year, over 400,000 entries were facilitated from Gaza into Israel, mostly workers coming to work in Israel with work permits. as a result of increasing international pressure to make security concessions and seek to normalize, if that word can be used, relationships with Hamas. And this was part of the Hamas plan of gathering specific, detailed information, intelligence about their targets. And they came armed with exact maps detailing communities, how many people per household, how many children, and what exactly they were to do to each family. This was coordinated. It was an assault that was organized so that the terrorists that infiltrated spread out across the entire border, across what has been reported as 30 locations. And it is clear now that this was some 2 years in the planning. So international pressure for security concessions and to take Hamas and other terrorist organizations on the basis that there is a possibility of engagement and negotiation is a significant factor in what we have seen. Another aspect has been discussed in much of the analysis over the last 10 days is the stopping of money from Qatar. There's also been a conversation about the disillusionment of Hamas, in particular in Gaza, in terms of the international discussion of who would replace Abbas, given that he is very, very advanced in his years and by some reports somewhat infirm. And there was a sense that Hamas were being overlooked by the international community. So that sort of power struggle at the macro level, and then, of course, at the micro level, in terms of what we have witnessed of the power struggles between Yahya Sinwar and Salah Haruri, the power struggle to demonstrate who could essentially slaughter more Jews. Added to that, we've seen quite a bit of discussion about the implications of the Abraham Accords potentially extending to include Saudi Arabia, and how this has necessarily infuriated the Iranians and potentially caused them to pressure their terror proxies to begin this sort of activity in order to scupper those accords. There are other underlying factors where the international community has had a significant amount of involvement, and that includes the long-term Palestinian Authority and Hamas brainwashing of Palestinians. So for 30 years, as a result of Palestinian control over the education system and Western-funded textbooks, demonizing Israel and Israelis, calling for the slaughter of Jews, exalting martyrdom. And it is through this intense brainwashing that we saw what these 3,000 terrorists were capable of in terms of the atrocities that were committed against Jewish Israeli civilians. Maurice Hirsch of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs has provided some statistical analysis to the effect that 3 out of 4 of the terrorists who butchered and burned and raped on the 7th of October grew up in and were educated in the UNRWA school system and were taught the curriculum of the Palestinian Authority. Now, none of this has been hidden. It has been the subject of repeated reports by Palestinian Media Watch, by Impact SE, campaigns by NGO Monitor to address international funding of incitement and of incentives to terror. And I also include in this equation of the constant incitement and incentivization, the rewards for terror, the pay for slay program, entrenched as it is in Palestinian law, the financial reward to all terrorists involved in fighting Israel, according to the severity of their crimes. And it's also worth picking up on reports that one of the terrorists responsible for the attack on the 7th of October, Ali Kadi, the commander of the Nukhbas force, he was released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal. But of course, the salary that he was paid for his terrorist crimes, he continued to receive even after his release on a monthly basis from the Palestinian Authority. And of course, that has allowed undoubtedly him to be involved in the planning, as we understand, for 2 years of the atrocities that were carried out. So all of that is extremely important in the context of international pressure and involvement. What we have witnessed in the last 16 years in terms of Hamas control Israel's withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, ultimately also hugely influenced by international pressure, is what has allowed these terrorists to embed themselves within the civilian population so that they have rocket launchers in civilian locations. And they do this, of course, because, as Mark has indicated, Israel does not target civilians. This is calculated. The war crimes that Hamas are committing, the metro of terror tunnels that they have built under the entire use of the Gaza Strip to facilitate their terror infrastructure, and of course the use of humanitarian aid. We've seen this in terms of water pipes being dug up to assist the terrorist effort, and Hamas stealing supplies from humanitarian organizations. Hamas has no qualms about this. It has put out pictures and evidence of its activities in this regard. And its use of UNRWA, UN institutions, is internationally known, as is its use of the Shifa Hospital in the center of Gaza, the largest hospital in Gaza, as its main command center. This is all out there, public, in the open, and has been consistently ignored by the international community, which has continued to pressure Israel vis-a-vis its engagement with Hamas and other terrorist organizations, and its ability to defend itself has been necessarily impacted as a result of that. One aspect that we haven't covered quite yet, and I'm sure it may come up in more detail maybe in questions, is the siege that was announced, and there are big aspects of the factual matrix which are also being utterly misrepresented in the media in that respect. But I just touch on one aspect of it, which is that Israel in normal times supplies what is thought to be about 50% of Gaza's electricity. And on the basis of that, we've seen Gazan Hamas terrorists stealing what was thought to be some 24,000 litres of fuel from UNRWA installations in order to continue its terror operations. And the last just two aspects which I just want to touch on in terms of the approach of the international community is in relation to international legal bodies. I'm looking at our audience, and I think they will probably be intimately familiar with the agenda in the international legal arena against Israel at bodies like the UN Human Rights Council, at the International Criminal Court, and most recently at the International Court of Justice, and how a vicious cycle of manufacturing law and allegations against Israel has been fueled by armies of NGOs. I say it's a vicious cycle because one sees one aspect feeding the other. And this harkens back to Mahmoud Abbas's intention over a decade ago to internationalize this conflict as a legal matter, not just a political matter. And the generation of false allegations and material against Israel by NGOs fed through the UN Human Rights Council into the reports of the special rapporteurs, fed again into the international legal institutions such as the ICC and the ITJ, has this effect of manufacturing allegations, fact and law, against Israel. And the impact of that has been to increase international pressure on Israel and to prevent itself from being able to properly defend itself. It has informed every aspect of the causes of this and the international responsibility for this that I have already outlined. Legal delegitimization leads to international pressure, which hamstrings Israel from dealing properly with the threats that it is facing. And there are strong arguments that this has led to the harrowing events that we witnessed just over 10 days ago, and of course subsequently, as rockets are continuing to fall. Another aspect of the incitement to terrorism and attacks on Jewish communities that I think it's important to raise, because communities around the Jewish world are also facing difficulties as a result of these changing dynamics. Immediately after the atrocities on September on the 7th of October, of course, there were Jewish tourists murdered by an Egyptian policeman. We have seen reports only in the last couple of hours that a synagogue was firebombed in Berlin. Anti-Semitic attacks are at unprecedented levels. And as we have seen groups at university campuses across the world are voicing support for Hamas, this is only set to worsen. I can say from a UK perspective that the Home Secretary here, Suella Braverman, issued guidance to the police in order to better tackle hate speech and incitement and support for Hamas, which is here a prescribed group. So any support for Hamas would be a criminal offence. And she has also come out to denounce the chant from the river to the sea as a genocidal chant. But unfortunately, authorities really are on the back foot, and they need to be held to account by lawyers and concerned individuals. And I would say that UK LFI, UK Lawyers for Israel, is seeking to assist us as best as it can. And if anyone would wish to volunteer and get involved, please do contact us via the website. It really is all hands on deck at the moment in Israel and around the world in dealing with these repercussions. So I think that probably takes me to the end of my time, and thank you so much. I do welcome your questions.
Natasha, thank you very much. Many questions, and I'll try to get to a lot of them, and I have some of my own questions. Just want to explain a little bit more about ILF and the work that we do. We are a network of 4,000 lawyers around the world, based at an NGO in Tel Aviv. And we work to advocate for Israel from a legal perspective. We're really drawing a line of how to review these matters, strictly thinking from a legal perspective. Although many of the people here are likely lawyers, not everyone has to be. We're trying to approach this in a way that for us as lawyers, how we should be looking at these. And lawyers know that they need to formulate an argument in any manner that they approach in order to understand the fundamentals of the argument. I always used to say that for myself, in any negotiation, I was an effective negotiator and was able to conclude a transaction only if I truly understood the other side. So I think this works, and some questions have been raised to that as well. And before I get some questions, I just have a couple of things that you both drew upon. And Mark, you said that Israel has an obligation on behalf of the world with respect to the prevention of genocide. And as well, Natasha, you spoke about UN Resolution 1373, which also links the world. So if I extrapolate from both of them, there's a legal obligation that Israel has insofar as, I don't mean to be dramatic about this, but protecting the entire world, or acting on behalf of the entire world. I'd like you to comment on that and whether you think that should be a legal approach that is taken as well by Israel and in some of the media or however presentations we make to stipulate those specific legal obligations on behalf of the rest of the world. If you could address, both of you could address that a little bit, and then we can move on to some other questions. Mark, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry. Listen, Hamas told us who they were on day one, right? Their founding charter says we're here to commit genocide against Jews around the world, period. And over the course of the last 20 plus years, they've told us that again repeatedly in their actions and in their speeches. There are speeches where Hamas leaders have openly admitted genocide. Even one I just was resurfacing on Twitter yesterday, they said, by the way, it's not just Israel, we're coming for the Christians next. So if you're not standing up for Israel, stand up for yourselves, or else there'll be no one else left to stand with you. The world never took us seriously, right? People have been banging the drum and saying this is a genocidal terrorist organization, and there was a segment of society willing to say it's just political rhetoric. They don't mean it, even as throats were slit. But there was a decision made by the state of Israel early in this conflict, about a day in, from what I was told by people who were in the know, that in general, Israel has actually worked very hard in the past not to release the kind of pictures that we're seeing because of Kavod Hamet, because of dignity of the dead. They've suffered enough. They don't have to have their corpses paraded around the world to be denied as they were. But this time, This time, when the charge of genocide is so real and pertinent and clear, Israel made the decision to release those pictures and to show the world the atrocities, and it's having an effect. And I think it's noticeable even in something as subtle as the messaging coming out of the White House. So in President Biden's remarks on October 10th, he actually said Israel has the right, no, Israel has the duty to respond to Hamas. And I believe that is reflective of the fact that finally people are taking seriously the fact that this is a genocidal organization, and that obviously has tremendous implications in terms of proportionality. You're not just dealing with a lone wolf or a lone pack or an isolated unit. You're dealing with a group that wants and is hell-bent on genocide and perhaps world domination. You have to take them out.
The only thing I would add to that is that, albeit possibly fluffy, the international community and states parties to the convention and also UN member states on the basis of the UN Security Council resolution are mandated, are required to act against terrorism and genocide. So there are legal obligations outside of Israel's, and I think we need to put a great deal of pressure to ensure that those are being properly recognized and actioned, in particular where the funding of terrorism is concerned, and where the promotion of and incitement towards terrorism is concerned. The only word of caution I would perhaps voice at this juncture is that the world now seems to have finally woken up to Hamas. But of course, this is not just Hamas. I mentioned that there were many other groups, terrorist organizations involved directly in the 7th of October attacks. But subsequently, we have also seen that Mahmoud Abbas refused to condemn the atrocities. They have been referred to as resistance by spokespeople for the Palestinians around the world. Hanan Ashrawi has been on every single broadcast media saying exactly this. I indicated that the Pay for Slay program, which is Palestinian Authority funds, are paid to terrorists irrespective of their denomination. And so the danger here exists that if Hamas is in fact defeated and if Israel is successful in its aims, that the day after Hamas, we end up back at square one, with all of the causes that I identified, where the international community bears significant responsibility, continuing on the basis that they make the same excuses, that they turn the same blind eye to other genocidal terrorist groups on the basis that they seek to distinguish them because they coalesce under a different banner.
Thank you both. Going back to a question that I asked earlier, to Mark, and I just want to touch on that in the internet, the legal role of the International Red Cross with respect to hostages, which is if one of you could discuss that as well. And the question that was posed was how does the proportionality analysis change in any respect with regards to the hostages that we know that are taken? Mark, you're on mute, sorry.
Natasha, do you want to start or?
It was posed to you, I think. So by all means, I'll follow up.
Either of you, it's fine. Go.
So let's start with the absolute basic premise, which is that taking hostages is a war crime, and no one, even on Hamas's side, generally is trying to defend it, except that, well, Israel had it coming. But taking hostages is clearly a war crime. So how does it affect proportionality? There's no direct line. It affects what Israel has to do as a matter of self-defense and what that self-defense looks like in a proportionate perspective. So let's walk it back even further than proportionality, and let's do this. This comes out of something I was writing about on Twitter. Let's do this on a second grade level, okay? Because that's generally the level that people understand retributive justice, okay? Article 51 of the UN Charter establishes the right of self-defense, okay? The test for what is appropriate self-defense is called the Caroline test. It comes from an 1837 boat incident, but that's the customary international law standard, and that determines legitimacy of self-defense. It says, even if self-defense is necessary, the actions taken also have to be proportionate to the dangers that are facing the state. So it's really just a restatement of proportionality. Your self-defense has to be proportionate. Okay. Judge Baxter from the International Court of Justice, he once explained, it's conceivable that in some instances, the complete subjugation of a persistent aggressor may be the only way to maintain territorial integrity and political independence of the state attacked. So, for example, hypothetically, if you had a situation where you have an openly genocidal terrorist organization that keeps on trying to kill every single one of your people and ethnically cleanse you from the river to the sea, that might be one of those areas where you need to subjugate them. Okay, so from an international legal perspective, the response is, but hold on a second, second grade terms, it's not fair. They touched base. They went back to base. This is not tag, right? There's no base. You can't touch base. You can't get someone out to touch base. Thankfully, that's wrong, because if that were true, then all the terrorist would ever have to do is run home and hide behind a child, and then they can go back and commit terror with impunity, right? It can't be like that. So the law has to be much more nuanced than that. Okay, so back to our playground analogy. If you are allowed to hit back, right, even if they're on base, how hard can you hit back? Okay, and that's where proportionality comes in again. And the short answer is this: you're allowed to hit back just hard enough so they can't keep hitting you again. Again, it's not proportionate. Can't hit back as hard as they hit. You can hit them back hard enough that they can't hit you again. Hans Kelsen, a very famous international legal theorist, said, I remember exactly what he said. He said, a right of self-defense is without substance if it does not permit the removal of the danger which initially justified the resort to the measure of self-defense. So if somebody is hitting you with a hammer, right, self-defense allows you to take away the hammer. You don't have to then just put the hammer down. You can keep the hammer. You can keep the hammer and you can break the hammer, right? In this situation, you can take out Hamas. You don't just declare a ceasefire and let them go back to rebuilding their terrorist infrastructure. Okay, now, again, so how does that affect the hostages? Well, if you don't respond with incredible force when they take hostages, you teach them that they can take hostages again. Now, I'm not in any way opining on what Israel should or shouldn't do here. There are tremendously complicated questions and costs on every side of this equation, and there are no good answers, and we're praying for miracles, period. But in terms of the way that it affects proportionality, Hamas has laid all of its cards on the table. We're going to kill you, and we're going to try to do it and inflict the most pain as possible. And Israel has every right to respond with a shock and awe response. Now, again, just to keep things in our playground analogy for one more second, right? If Hamas would go to the teacher and turn themselves in, everything would be over. So if Hamas would surrender and give back the hostages, there would be no more casualties on either side. And it boggles the mind that the international law community is putting pressure on Israel to give up and not Hamas. Maybe it's too much to ask, but if so, the question is, why is Jewish blood cheaper, right? Why would you ask the Jews to turn the other cheek? So all of the pressure that's being directed towards Israel from the international law community, all of this, we want to save innocent civilians, every last ounce of that should be directed towards Hamas, who, by the way, have the legal obligation to actually take their civilians to safety as opposed to hiding behind them as human shields, and the legal obligation to give back the hostages, and the legal obligation to stop being a terrorist organization. So for all of those reasons, it definitely has an effect, and that effect can't really be measured in advance. It can only be justified after.
Question with respect to the justified afterwards: does Israel have to give an explanation with regards to the pinpoints of who they attacked? You know, the targets that they had. Is there a legal obligation to explain that? Because we don't know. And one of the viewers here has asked that question. I mean, how do we know why they've taken out X, Y, or Z building? We don't have that information. Therefore, are we going to get that information? Should we get that information? We understand things are under military control, and we want to win this battle. But ultimately, is Israel have a legal responsibility under law to disclose why they attacked each and every place? We know that Hamas won't be put to the same test, or maybe in theory they are, but we know they won't answer that. But do we have that obligation in Israel?
So I'll answer that in three ways. Number one, I'll quote General Petraeus from yesterday, who said, when it comes to believing the IDF or Hamas, I think the answer is you believe the IDF, right? So that's the first answer, is that sometimes it's common sense. But in terms of a legal obligation, It could be, yeah. So, if, for example, if Israel is hauled up in theory in front of a legal tribunal that it respects the authority of and is accused of a crime, it would have to prove why it was disproportionate. But we're not going to get there because Israel actually does release that information, right? So you will often hear Israel or the United States, for example, Joe Biden this morning, President Biden said that he was shown evidence that it was in fact a Hamas or a related terrorist organization that took out the hospital yesterday. Israel always shares that intelligence information in as close to real time as possible with its allies for those reasons. And in general, afterwards, it does release reports explaining why any attack was given proportional. And by the way, sometimes it may turn out, and it's happened before in the reports, that the commander in the field made a mistake and they were excessive. That doesn't mean that it was unlawful. It means that it was a reasonable mistake to have made, and they release all of that information very publicly.
Natasha? Yeah, go ahead.
All of those reports are available. And there is absolutely no excuse for academics, especially in the field of international humanitarian law, to be repeating the false allegations of war crimes and disproportional responses time after time, when Israel's track record throughout every previous operations, and despite the different scale, there is zero indication that its adherence to international law has in any way changed in the context of this operation. All of that is out there, and I would encourage certainly members of the audience in particular, outside of the Israeli internal reports that are published, to look at the high-level military group, a collective of extremely senior military officials from around the world who have conducted their own analysis of Israel's past operations, and the consistent conclusion that has been drawn by professionals in other Western democratic law-abiding militaries is that Israel goes over and above the requirements of international law in the context of its military practices, and that is reinforced by the involvement of lawyers in every strike decision, from the military advocate general court that sits outside of the chain of command within the IDF. They report to the Attorney General, so that sits outside of the normal military ranks, so that they are able to tell more senior officers that strikes are unlawful and therefore don't get carried out. Just a couple of additional points I might pick up with respect to Article 51 of the UN Charter. The refrain that we are hearing now so often is what the international community or international law are allowing Israel to do. And I think it's important in that context to clarify that Article 51 recognizes an inherent right to self-defense. It does not bestow on any state that right because that right is considered to be so fundamental. That is not something that international law provides. It can only recognize what is a natural and pre-existing and obvious right. And so far as the hostages are concerned, where on earth is the International Committee of the Red Cross in all of this? Why have they not been on the ground in Gaza? And where is the international outcry for the return of those hostages unharmed? This is absolutely astonishing that the international focus would now be on vilifying Israel, and in particular on attributing to Israel an evil intent, because that is the only explanation for the falsification of these allegations and the inversion of international law in the reporting that we are seeing across the board.
Thank you both very much. I'm going to wrap up. We have only a few minutes, and I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to ask Asher Stern, my colleague, to put up a page. I think you can upload that, Asher, and show information that we have and how you can engage with us. We have lots of material that can be used for yourself, for your own advocacy. We recommend that you do that to continue to be engaged with us, as well as our general email address, which is info@ilfngo.org. I want to say, just in the last couple of minutes, on a personal level, we urge everybody to continue to doing all the things that they are doing, advocating locally and internationally. And on a personal level, those of us in Israel do appreciate very much the contact that our friends and family are giving to us, just checking in on us. Those are also very important factors. Let's not forget the personal stuff as well. That touch does make a difference to all of us here. Final words to both Natasha and Mark. I want to say thank you, but I'll leave it with both of you to give your final comments. Thank you.
But I was, forgive me, Mark being the certainly more senior individual, I'm extremely grateful for I have to say, perhaps if you'll allow me, I'm extremely grateful for your leadership and that of several other very busy currently international law academics who are publishing on this frequently. That is so important in light of the unbelievable coverage that we have been seeing. In particular, we haven't talked about the hospital strike yet today, but the manner in which so many broadcast media attributed that to an Israeli airstrike without evidence, simply parroting Hamas propaganda. It is at times like this that proper legal analysis across every single outlet is so fundamental and important. And in particular, if I could just finally seek the support of the audience in pushing back against the media narrative and the misrepresentations, because that is having a hugely significant impact. And that is where every single individual is able to have an effect in making complaints, in seeking regulator involvement in how these matters are being reported, because we saw only yesterday the levels of incitement that arise when false information is put out there and when false allegations of war crimes are being leveled at Israel. So thank you to everyone who is publishing on this from the bottom of my heart. And I hope that that will encourage other people to pick up these arguments, to make them to authority, to media regulators, and as much as possible to the general public online, because increasingly we're seeing this as a battle being fought in social media.
Thank you. Mark.
I mean, there's an overwhelming deluge of misinformation and purposeful disinformation being spread. And again, to sort of echo what Natasha so eloquently said, everyone can play a part in trying to help. So if you can't write an op-ed, you can forward one, or you can show a like, or you can do something. You can write a letter back to the editor. Don't let things fall. One thing that I want to stress, I've been stressing a lot, is especially outside of Israel. So we know that the paradigm has shifted in Israel, and life is never going to be the same. The paradigm, I believe, has shifted here as well, here being the United States, the UK, everywhere outside of Israel, which is that we have seen, this whole debate about anti-Zionism or the masks are off. They're off. And people who are supporting an openly anti-Semitic, genocidal terror organization are not our friends, never were our friends, never will be our friends. And we cannot forget that, and we cannot normalize it. Okay, what people like Rashida Tlaib and Ilan Omar have done very successfully over the last several years is shift the Overton window ever slightly forward, ever slightly more, on what it's acceptable to say in polite society, to the point that it is now acceptable to say in polite society that you're okay with genocide against the Jewish people. There has to be a line drawn in the sand. Thankfully, people like Bill Ackman, Mark Rowan, public figures are drawing that line in the sand, and we have to stand behind them and support them. No politician that equivocated on Israel and genocide should ever get another Jewish vote or another Jewish dollar. No institution that equivocated on whether it was contextually appropriate to behead a baby and to burn it should ever get another institutional dollar or another institutional vote of support. None. And we need to be clear and firm. There are not many things that the entire Jewish community they should, but there are not many things the entire Jewish community does stand united in favor of. But preventing another genocide against our people and saying it's not okay to call for it has to be that line that we draw, and to stay strong and not let it become normalized. And in a month from now, not let it be just something that happened.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your strong words. Thank you for everybody who attended. We will try to do these as best as we can. We want to do them short, to the point, and give people resources. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And again, my regards from Arsen, who's currently at the European Parliament in Strasbourg, making a presentation on behalf of all of us. Thank you all for joining us today.